Mark Carney enters the fray. The Bank of Canada's former governor takes a critical role to help the Prime Minister.
The Liberal Party has announced Mark Carney will lead a new task force on economic growth.
The deficit ballooning to nearly $62 billion.
$61.9 billion. That's the deficit.
If Carney-Trudeau policies did this much economic harm before tariffs, imagine the devastation they would cause after tariffs.
Pierre Poilievre, with his simplistic and misleading axe the tax, doesn't care about either problem.
Pierre Poilievre is no stranger to calling out what he sees as deception in Canadian politics. And this time, his target is Mark Carney. The battle between these two figures centers around one of the most controversial policies in Canada today, the carbon tax.
Combining Trump's tariffs with Carney's carbon tax will decimate our industries and destroy the jobs of our workers. The worst Liberal tax of all has been the carbon tax, championed by Trudeau and his economic advisor, Mark Carney, whose only complaint was that the tax was not high enough. Now he plans a pre-election trick.
Poilievre has made it clear that he believes Carney is misleading Canadians about both the true cost of the tax and its future under his leadership. As we move forward, I'd like to ask you a quick favor to subscribe and like this video. It takes just a second and helps us so much. Poilievre argues that Carney is not only hiding the real impact of this tax, but is also playing a sneaky political game by temporarily taking it out of sight before an election only to bring it back in full force afterward. It's a strategy that, according to Poilievre, is designed to keep Canadians in the dark until it's too late to do anything about it. And while Carney has recently suggested that he wants to change the tax rather than eliminate it,
Pierre Poilievre, with his simplistic and misleading axe the tax, doesn't care about either problem. Now, that's possible because he doesn't really believe in climate change. Or it's possible he thinks that Canada, for the first time in our history, should be a free rider on a massive global problem, leaving for other countries to solve. It's certainly clear that he doesn't really understand how important that money in the rebate is to hardworking families across the country. But we get it. We care. And that's why our plan will directly solve both problems by both implementing new climate policies that are at least as effective in lowering emissions and by bringing forward new economic measures that will make Canadian families better off.
Poilievre sees this as just another way of saying Canadians will still be paying, just in a different form. So, what's going on? Why is Carney so determined to keep this tax, and why does Poilievre believe it's a massive scam? To understand that, we have to look at Carney's long history of pushing for higher carbon taxes and how he has positioned himself as a key player in shaping this policy. Mark Carney has been one of the strongest voices in favor of the carbon tax, standing firmly alongside Prime Minister Justin Trudeau in advocating for it. But he hasn't just supported the tax, he's been one of its biggest champions, arguing that it's not high enough. That's right, Carney's main complaint hasn't been about how the tax affects ordinary Canadians, but rather that it doesn't take enough money from them. This is the same tax that has driven up the cost of living, increased gas prices, and added financial strain to families already struggling with inflation. Yet Carney continues to push for it, insisting that it's necessary for Canada's future. Poilievre, on the other hand, sees it as nothing more than a financial burden disguised as environmental policy. He argues that rather than helping the planet, the carbon tax is just another way for the government to take more money from taxpayers.
Because the Carney-Trudeau carbon tax on farmers and truckers rose the price. Now, what have the Carney-Trudeau Liberals done about this? Well, they doubled the debt. They doubled housing costs. They doubled food bank lineups. They blocked Canadian energy in favor of dirty dictator oil. They raised taxes on work and investment and have driven an astonishing, eye-watering $500 billion to the United States in Canadian investment that now pays to create American jobs. All of this before a single tariff was applied. Now, Liberals would like to instrumentalize the tariff threat to distract.
What makes Carney's stance even more concerning, according to Poilievre, is the timing of his actions. Just before an election, Carney plans to step back, keeping quiet about the tax so that it doesn't become a major issue during the campaign. The idea is simple. If people aren't constantly reminded about how much the tax is costing them, they might not think about it when they vote.
You know, it's funny. First, the Liberals said, Poilievre has no policies. And then they said, okay, he does, but they're really scary. And now they say, they agree with all my policies. You know, imitation is the highest form of flattery, but you cannot believe them. My friends, it is not realistic that we would believe a party 60 days before election suddenly reversing itself on absolutely everything. If you want conservative policies, you will have to vote conservative.
But Poilievre isn't letting that slide. He's making it clear that Canadians deserve to know the truth about what Carney is planning and how much it will cost them in the long run. Timing is everything in politics, and Mark Carney seems to know that well. Just before calling the election, he had planned a pre-election trip, one that, at first glance, might seem like routine political maneuvering. But according to Pierre Poilievre, there's a much more calculated strategy at play. This isn't just about meeting voters or setting the stage for a campaign. It's about controlling the narrative and making sure certain inconvenient truths stay out of the spotlight.
Take the carbon tax. Take the carbon tax. Yeah, and you know what to do with it. You know, before the tariff threats, we were talking about a carbon tax election. But now with these threats, I have to concede I've had to reflect on whether it is a top-of-mind issue. And after much reflection, I have concluded that the carbon tax will be an even bigger issue in the coming election than we thought. Combining Trump's tariffs with Carney's carbon tax will decimate our industries and destroy the jobs of our workers. The worst Liberal tax of all has been the carbon tax, championed by Trudeau and his economic advisor, Mark Carney, whose only complaint was that the tax was not high enough. Now he plans a pre-election trick. Next month, just days before he calls the election, Mr. Carney will pause the carbon tax, hide it out of sight so that you won't see it for the duration of the election period. And the media will tell you forget all about it until the election is over, at which time, God forbid, if he were re-elected, he would bring in a much bigger tax that has no rebate whatsoever.
This kind of political bait and switch isn't new, but it's particularly troubling given what's at stake. Canadians deserve transparency about policies that will affect their daily lives, not a strategic game of hide-and-seek designed to push an unpopular tax through the back door. Poilievre is sounding the alarm now because he knows once the election dust settles, it'll be too late for voters to change their minds. When politicians start playing with words, it's usually because they don't want you to see what's really going on. That's exactly the case with Mark Carney's latest approach to the carbon tax. Instead of outright defending it, he's shifted his language, now saying he doesn't want to axe the tax, but rather change it. On the surface, this might sound like a middle ground solution, a reasonable compromise. But Pierre Poilievre isn't buying it, and he doesn't think Canadians should either. The most important question that has not been addressed is, how much is this actually going to cost? Because no matter how he spins it, there's no world in which this policy shift comes at zero cost to taxpayers. The problem isn't just the tax itself, it's the ripple effect it creates. Every time the carbon tax goes up, the cost of living follows. Gas prices climb, making it more expensive for people to get to work, transport goods, and heat their homes. Businesses, especially small ones, struggle to absorb the extra costs, which means they pass them down to consumers. At the end of the day, Poilievre's warning is simple. Don't be fooled. A tax by any other name is still a tax, and whether Carney calls it a change or something else, the result is the same. Canadians will be paying more, and if they don't demand answers now, they'll be stuck footing the bill later. What do you think? Let us know in the comments.